Ukraine pushed the Russian army back on Saturday, not with a single dramatic breakthrough, but with a methodical, coordinated pressure that turned 4 kilometers of contested ground into 4 kilometers of Ukrainian-controlled ground before nightfall. Saturday, March 7th dawn, Zaporizhzhia Oblast. The Ukrainian 65th Mechanized Brigade had been holding a line that had not moved in 11 weeks. 11 weeks of artillery exchanges, drone strikes, infantry probing, and the grinding cost of holding static positions against a Russian force that had been reinforced twice in that period. The line had not moved because neither side had assembled the combination of fires, maneuver, and logistics that turning a static line requires. On March 7th, the Ukrainian side had assembled it. The Russian side had not reinforced a third time. The combination was the product of 6 weeks of preparation that the NATO support architecture had made possible. And the gap between what the Ukrainian force could bring to bear on Saturday morning and what the Russian defending force had been built to handle was the gap that 4 kilometers of movement would close. The preparation had 3 components. The first was attrition. Over 6 weeks preceding March 7th, the Ukrainian fires architecture, HIMARS, PZH-2000, drone-directed artillery, and the AN TPQ-37 counter-battery radar, had been targeting the Russian defensive grouping's logistics chain with a specificity that degraded its ability to sustain standard ammunition consumption rates. Not a complete interdiction. Russian logistics under HIMARS pressure had adapted by dispersing nodes, reducing convoy sizes, and using night movement on secondary routes. But the adaptation had not fully compensated for the attrition. The Russian artillery battalion in the sector had been firing at 60% of its standard daily rate for 3 weeks, not because it lacked weapons or crews, but because the ammunition flow to its forward supply points had been degraded enough that the battalion commander had imposed fire rationing to preserve stocks for the engagements he assessed as most critical. Fire rationing in the defending artillery was the operational condition the Ukrainian attack required to advance without being suppressed out of the approach. The second component was intelligence. 6 weeks of daily satellite imagery over the defensive sector, supplemented by TB2 collection during gaps in the satellite's revisit cycle, and by signals intelligence that had mapped the Russian battalion's communication architecture to the specific positions that were using each frequency. The intelligence picture by March 7 was the most detailed the brigade's planning staff had produced for any operation in the previous 8 months. It was detailed enough that the operation order had assigned individual fire missions to positions by specific grid rather than by assessed area, not suppress the anti-tank position in grid square X, but destroy the Kornet launcher at grid coordinate Y. The difference between grid square targeting and coordinate targeting was the difference between fires that suppressed and fires that destroyed. Suppression requires the system to be present throughout the assault. Destruction means the system is gone before the assault begins. The third component was logistics. The 65th Brigade had been resupplied over the preceding 2 weeks with a priority allocation that the Combined Arms Army's logistics staff had built specifically around the requirements of the March 7 operation. 150 mm ammunition at 140% of standard holding levels, Bradley 25mm ammunition at 160%, Excalibur GPS-guided rounds pre-positioned at the PZH-2000 battery at 180% of the standard allocation, and a forward fuel point established 8 kilometers behind the line of departure, specifically for the exploitation phases vehicles. The NATO logistics architecture that had built this pre-positioning, 22 partner nations contributing to the ammunition supply chain, a Czech-managed clearinghouse coordinating 155mm deliveries from 7 production sources, an American production increase that had raised the monthly 155mm output to a rate that the Ukrainian consumption level at attack tempo could sustain without rationing, had placed the physical means of the operation in position before the operation launched. The HIMARS rockets were in the launchers. The Excalibur rounds were in the PZH-2000 ammunition bays. The Bradley 25mm was in the vehicle ready racks. The fuel was 8 kilometers back. The logistics had been solved before the tactical problem was presented to it. What's your call? Type A if the 6-week attrition campaign against the Russian artillery's logistics chain Reducing the defending artillery to 60% firing rate was the single most decisive preparation for March 7th. Type B, if the logistics buildup that placed 180% Excalibur allocation and 160% Bradley ammunition in position before the operation was the more operationally enabling preparation. Drop your answer below. The operations fires plan began at 4:30 a.m., not suppression, not area fires. A 22-target precision engagement sequence running from 4:30 a.m. to 5:45 a.m., 75 minutes of specific weapons against specific positions. The first 8 targets were the Russian artillery positions. The two S-19 Mechanized batteries whose fire rationing had been forced by 6 weeks of logistics attrition, now targeted for destruction rather than additional attrition. HIMARS GMLRS rockets. All 8 positions engaged. 6 destroyed in the first salvo assessment. 2 survived the first salvo. 1 because the two S-19 had apparently displaced in the preceding 4 hours from the position the ISR had fixed. And 1 because the GMLRS round's impact produced a near miss that the thermal imagery assessed as leaving the howitzer mobile but damaged. The surviving displaced two S-19 was tracked by TB2 to its new position and engaged with a second GMLRS at 5:12 a.m. destroyed. The damaged but mobile two S-19 displaced to a third position and was engaged at 5:34 a.m. when the TB2 reacquired it. The third engagement produced a confirmed kill. By 5:34 a.m., all 8 Russian artillery positions in the sector had been destroyed or assessed as non-functional. The defending artillery that had been firing at 60% rate for 3 weeks was now firing at 0. The anti-armor fires ran from 4:50 a.m. to 5:40 a.m. 14 Kornet and Concur's anti-tank guided missile positions mapped across the defensive depth, engaged in the sequence that prioritized the positions covering the main assault axis. Excalibur rounds from the PZH-2000 battery. 11 of the 14 were engaged before H-hour. 9 confirmed destroyed. 2 probable kills. The post-strike imagery showed launcher damage but not the unambiguous destroyed-in-place signature that full confirmation required. 3 were not engaged before H-hour because the satellite imagery had fixed them at positions that the Excalibur's GPS guidance could service. But the fire mission timeline ran out before all 14 could be addressed. Those 3 would need to be managed by Trophy APS, Javelin teams, or Bradley direct fire during the assault. They were known. Their positions were in the assault company commander's operation orders. They were expected. At 5:45 a.m., the assault began. The 65th Brigade's task organization was a single combined arms team on the main axis. 3 Leopard 2A6 tanks, 8 M2A2 Bradleys, 2 CV-90 infantry fighting vehicles, and 2 infantry companies mounted and dismounted, supporting a dedicated PZH-2000 section on call for direct support fires, 2 Javelin teams in Overwatch on the assault force's right flank covering the most likely armored counterattack axis, and the TB2 overhead maintaining the ISR picture that connected all fires to the brigade's fire cell. The task organization was smaller than a full breakthrough operation warranted. This was not a breakthrough. It was a deliberate attack to seize and hold specific terrain features. A low ridgeline 2.4 kilometers north of the current forward line, and a village at the 4-kilometer mark that the intelligence assessed as the Russian battalion's secondary command post location. The Leopards made first contact at 5:58 a.m. at a range of 900 meters from the Russian forward trench, one of the 3 Kornet positions that the pre-assault fires hadn't reached. The Kornet team fired 2 missiles, both intercepted by Trophy APS on the lead and second Leopard at 8 and 14 meters respectively. The Leopards continued forward. The PZH-2000 section on call received the Kornet firing grid at 5:59 a.m. from the forward fire support officer. Excalibur round in the air at 6:00 a.m., impact at 6:01 a.m. The Kornet team that the pre-assault fire's timeline hadn't reached was destroyed 62 seconds after it fired its first missile. The remaining 2 unengaged Kornet positions were both on the assault force's left flank, outside the immediate approach corridor, but potentially threatening the Bradley column as it advanced on the right. Both were engaged by Javelin teams in Overwatch at 6:04 a.m. and 6:07 a.m. respectively. Both destroyed. The anti-armor threat across the entire assault axis was 0 by 6:07 a.m., 22 minutes after the assault began, at a point when the lead Leopards were 600 meters from the Russian forward trench. Subscribe to my channel and hit the bell. Every fire's mission, every Kornet intercept, every kilometer of ground pushback, broken down completely at the level the news coverage never reaches. The Russian trench contact at 6:11 a.m. was different from the breakthrough operations the brigade had executed previously. This was not a prepared defensive position that had been optimized for armored assault. It was a position that had been designed for attrition defense, holding ground against infantry and artillery pressure, not stopping a combined arms assault with trophy-equipped Leopards and Javelin overwatch, and 17 of 22 anti-armor systems destroyed before the assault reached the trench line. The Russian company holding the forward trench had its 3 crew-served machine gun positions in its RPG section and the 2 remaining anti-tank capabilities that consisted of 1 AT-4 team and 1 shoulder-fired Kornet that had been held in reserve and was now the last dedicated anti-armor system between the advancing Ukrainian force and the Ridgeline objective 2.4 kilometers further north. The shoulder-fired Kornet fired at 6:14 a.m. at the lead Leopard at 400 meters. The round impacted the Leopard's lower hull front. The lower hull front on the Leopard 2A6 carries the thickest protection of any section of the vehicle, the result of years of incremental armor upgrades driven specifically by the threat assessment of tandem heat warheads in close combat. The Kornet's tandem heat warhead at 400 meters produced a penetration attempt that the protection level defeated. The Leopard halted briefly. The crew assessed the vehicle as fully operational. No hydraulic damage, no track damage, no fire, and the Leopard continued forward. The crew member who reported the contact on the command net used a tone that the company commander later described as suggesting mild irritation rather than alarm. The vehicle had absorbed a direct hit from the last anti-armor weapon in the Russian company's inventory at point-blank range and continued the assault. That tolerance for direct hits without mission kill was precisely the capability the NATO training staff had emphasized as the Leopard's operational value in close terrain assault. Not that it was invulnerable, but that the protection margin at the engagement ranges that deliberate attack produced was meaningful enough to keep the vehicle in the fight when older systems would have been lost. The AT-4 team that was the Russian company's last reserve was observed by the TB2 attempting to reposition to a new firing angle at 6:16 a.m. and was engaged by the PZH-2000 on-call section before completing the repositioning. The round impacted at 6:17 a.m. The AT-4 team did not complete the repositioning. The Ukrainian infantry dismounted at 6:19 a.m. and cleared the forward trench in 19 minutes. 7 Russian prisoners, 22 dead. The Russian company commander was among the dead, killed at the northern end of the trench when the clearing team reached his position. He had remained in position throughout the assault. The evidence of how the forward trench's defensive response had unraveled was present in the after-action reconstruction. A company that had entered the morning with a coherent anti-armor defense architecture, 2 Kornet teams on the assault axis, 1 shoulder-fired Kornet in reserve, 1 AT-4 team, had seen every element of that architecture engaged and destroyed before the Ukrainian infantry entered the trench. The infantry clearance was difficult. 19 minutes and the company commander dead was not an easy 19 minutes, but it was an infantry clearance problem rather than an armored assault problem, and that distinction was the product of every fire's mission that had run from 4:30 a.m. to 6:17 a.m. The Ridgeline objective was 2.4 kilometers beyond the forward trench. The assault force reached it at 8:07 a.m., 1 hour and 48 minutes after the forward trench clearance. The route had been contested at one point. A Russian reinforcement element of 4 BTR-82A armored personnel carriers that had departed the Russian battalion's rear area at 6:00 a.m., 11 minutes after the assault began, and that had been tracked by the TB2 as they moved south toward the fighting. The BTR-82A column reached a crossroads 1.4 kilometers north of the Ridgeline objective at 7:34 a.m. The HIMARS battery at corps level had been allocated the column as a priority target at 7:18 a.m. when the TB2 confirmed the column was moving south on a route that would reach the assault force's approach axis. 2 GMLRs rockets. The lead 2 BTRs were destroyed at the crossroads. The remaining 2 turned north and did not return. The 4-vehicle reinforcement that had been moving to contest the Ridgeline had 4 fewer vehicles for the effort than it started with. The effort did not materialize. What would you do as the Russian battalion commander at 8 a.m. on March 7th? Your artillery destroyed, 17 of 22 anti-armor systems gone before the assault reached the trench, your forward company reduced to 7 prisoners and 22 dead, your reinforcement column turned back by HIMARS at the crossroads, with the Ukrainian 65th Brigade on the ridgeline that commands observation over your entire rear area? Comment your remaining options below. The village at the 4-kilometer mark was reached at 10:14 a.m. The Russian battalion's secondary command post had been located in the village's municipal building based on signals intelligence confirmed by 3 weeks of regular communications intercept, showing the building as a consistent emission source on the battalion's command net frequencies. The planning staff had included the village in the objectives specifically because seizing or destroying the command post before the Russian command element could relocate was assessed as worth the operational cost of extending the assault's depth 1.6 kilometers beyond the ridgeline. The command post had been evacuated, not recently evacuated in a panic. The TB2's thermal observation of the village at 9:30 a.m., 44 minutes before the assault force arrived, had shown no vehicle heat signatures at the municipal building. The communications intercept archive was checked against the departure time. The last transmission from the building's identified frequency pattern had been at 7:12 a.m., 31 minutes after the forward trench was cleared. The Russian battalion commander had ordered the evacuation when the trench fell. The command vehicle had 44 minutes to clear the village before the assault force arrived. It had used them. The decision to order the evacuation at 7:12 a.m., 31 minutes into the assault before the ridgeline was reached and before the assault force's route to the village was confirmed, reflected either a pre-planned evacuation trigger or a battalion commander who had absorbed enough from the morning's events to assess that holding the command post would cost him the command element. What remained in the village was the logistics section that had been unable to load its material in the available evacuation window. 3 fuel canisters, 2 ammunition resupply pallets of 150 mm artillery rounds, and the communications shelter the command element had been operating from. None of these were the command staff. All of them were useful to the Ukrainian brigade's logistics officer, who assessed the captured 152 mm ammunition as compatible with Ukrainian artillery systems through an adapter kit the brigade had been issued specifically for captured Soviet-caliber rounds. The logistics section personnel, 6 soldiers, had been in the process of loading one of the ammunition pallets when the lead Bradley entered the village at 10:14 a.m. They surrendered without firing. They were the operation's last prisoners. The 65th Brigade established its defensive line on the ridgeline, and at the village at 11:30 a.m., 4 kilometers of Russian-held ground was now Ukrainian-held ground. Not breakthrough ground, no exploitation phase, no push toward a logistics hub, no raid into the depth. 4 kilometers that had been Russian since before Christmas were Ukrainian before noon on March 7th. The Russian battalion that had been holding those 4 kilometers had been reduced to a force that needed to be reconstituted before it could contest the ridgeline. The reconstitution would take days. The ridgeline was defensible ground that gave the Ukrainian brigade observation over the Russian rear area at a range that had previously required drone collection. The observation from the ridgeline was the operational product of the 4 kilometers. Not the 4 kilometers themselves, but what the 4 kilometers made possible to see. Don't miss the breakdown of how the observation from the new ridgeline position is reshaping Ukrainian fires targeting in the sector, and what the Russian reconstitution effort looks like from the position they no longer hold. Subscribe to my channel and hit that bell. Pushing back is not the same as breaking through. The breakthrough operations, the single dramatic day when armor crosses a defended line and drives into the depth, are the events that generate headlines and video. The pushback operations are the operations that create the conditions for the next breakthrough, the next exploitation, The next 48-hour raid into a logistics base. 4 kilometers of ground is 4 kilometers of buffer between a Ukrainian position and the Russian artillery that was ranging it. 4 kilometers of observation from a ridgeline is 4 kilometers of fire adjustment geometry that the brigade's forward observers now have over ground they previously could not see. 4 kilometers of Russian rear area visibility is 4 kilometers of HIMARS targeting data that was not available on Friday. The NATO support that built this pushback was the same support that built the breakthrough operations, the same Excalibur rounds, the same Trophy Leopards, the same HIMARS, the same TB2, the same AN/TPQ-37, the same logistics supply chain. It produced a different result on March 7th because the tactical objective was different. Not a logistics-based raid, not a minefield breach, a deliberate attack to take 4 kilometers of ground and hold it. The support produced what the objective required. The ridgeline was Ukrainian ground by 11:30 a.m. The Russian battalion was in reconstitution, and the brigade that had been static for 11 weeks was looking north from a position it hadn't occupied before Saturday. Was the pushback on March 7th primarily enabled by the 6 weeks of pre-operation work, the logistics attrition, the intelligence build, the ammunition pre-positioning, or by the fire's execution on the morning itself that destroyed the anti-armor architecture before the assault reached the trench? Type P for the 6 weeks of preparation was the decisive enabling factor. Type E for the morning fire's execution drove the result. Make your case below. 4 kilometers, 11 weeks held, 11 hours to take. The push was methodical, coordinated, and built on a support architecture that had been working the problem for 6 weeks before the assault force crossed the line of departure. The Russian army was pushed back on Saturday. The ridgeline it used to hold is the ridgeline the Ukrainian brigade is watching from today. That is what NATO support pushing back looks like when the preparation matches the objective and the execution matches the preparation. If this breakdown delivered the analysis you came here for, like the video, share it, and subscribe to my channel. Every fire sequence, every Kornet intercept, every kilometer pushed, we build it out completely. Which element of the NATO support architecture made the biggest difference on March 7th? The 6-week HIMARS attrition of the Russian artillery logistics chain, the Excalibur precision fires that destroyed 17 of 22 anti-armor systems before H-hour, the Trophy APS that let the Leopards absorb the surviving Kornet fire and keep moving, or the TB2 continuous ISR that connected the fires to every target from 4:30 a.m. to the ridgeline? Drop your analysis below.